Well, when Emery asked me about this, she said, would you do a teaching? I said, oh, sure. Then I said, well, on what? And so she sent me a section of the document Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council. Now, we're past 55 years since the end of the council. And as we got into the 40s years past the council, the Education Office had done a series of talks on different parts of the documents. And I know I had done some of the Christus Dominus and the other one on the church, but I hadn't really done anything as of this point on this particular document. And it seemed, of course, the focus was on culture. And so I began to think about how are we going to approach this? So I wanted to break this down into several parts. And the first part, I want to look at the document itself. Gaudium et Spes translates joy and hope. And within that document, they take a section to talk about the role of culture. Culture is what helps to make us who we are by shaping our language, our history, our ethics, our connection to the community. And it has a profound effect upon us and really helps to form our own philosophy. Now, the council document goes on to talk about the world today. It says we are conscious of the ability to shape culture and how cultures can be affected by other cultures. So, for example, if you go back to the 18th century, the diplomatic language was French because they were the predominant power in Europe at the time. Today, you would have to say the predominant language would be English. In fact, if you want to navigate a ship or fly an airplane, you have to speak English, because that's what is used in the control towers everywhere in the world. And so, and it's interesting how that dominance begins to have an effect on other cultures. The question that the council document asked was, how does faith maintain or preserve in a very humanistic or secular culture? They go on to reflect on the nature of the gospel, that the purpose of the gospel is to renew life and culture of fallen man. It's to combat sin, to remove errors and evils that result from the allurement to sin. And specifically, it is to elevate the morality of peoples. So for example, today we're fond of the multiculturalists who love to say how evil we are and how wonderful everything else was. I wonder if they would say the same thing about the Aztecs, who love to rip the beating heart out of their captives as offerings to their gods. Does that seem to be an element of their culture that probably needs to be elevated by the gospel or changed by the Lord? And of course, the early Spanish missionaries would affirm that yes, they did need to have that change. So the question is, does the gospel, is it the purpose of the church that the gospel transforms culture or accommodates to it? It goes on to talk about the duties of Christians to educate as a focus on the family, where we are nurtured in our basic parts. So in thinking about it, and that's pretty much where that little piece of the document is at. So I thought, well, where have we been? And one of the basic questions is that Jesus should change us. Faith should transform us, and in turn, we, the world. that I would say is the basic premise of Christianity, basic command of Jesus, actually. So if you look at the apostles, each of them had that personal relationship with Jesus, and it was a personal growth that resulted from that relationship. They were left in charge as our Lord returned to the Father, and they assumed the responsibilities for the church and for the church's mission. And it's interesting because at that moment, the apostles find themselves in basically a Jewish culture. Most of them are Jewish by upbringing, by culture, by language, by tradition. And you begin to see as you read your way through the New Testament that this begins to transform into a Christian culture. And it actually comes to a point where it's mentioned in the scriptures that people began to refer to these people following Jesus as Christians. And you begin to see this transition from the worship in the temple and the sacrifice in the temple to the church and to the celebration of Mass. I always find it fascinating when you talk about God's providence. In the year 70 AD, the Romans, because of a revolt in Israel, attacked, and they literally captured and sacked the city of Jerusalem, and they destroyed the temple at that point. And from there on, there's never been an offering of sacrifice in Judaism. They meet in the synagogue and pray together as a Jewish community. They don't offer sacrifice. With the destruction of the temple, that ended. But where is the sacrifice offered? It's in every Christian, every Catholic church, the sacrifice of the Mass. And so again, it's interesting, you begin to see this transformation of the early community from basically a Jewish culture, eventually reaching out to incorporate other peoples, but then completely transforming away from the basics of the Jewish culture into the Christian culture. The Council of Jerusalem around 50 AD, the question was, what's the role of the Mosaic law? What do we do about the commandments, about baptism? How do we understand how we become Christian? Do you have to first follow the Jewish law, get circumcised, and then get baptized and follow the Christian law, which is what most of the apostles did. That was their life. And there were some that were saying that you need to do that. But Paul came along and said, well, with all these non-Jewish people we're seeing, that doesn't seem to be important. Jesus said to be baptized. And so again, at the council, they essentially said that baptism was the entrance into the Christian community, and to follow the 10 Commandments, the basic moral laws taught by Jesus, and he reinforced what was taught in the Old Testament. But also that you would be mindful of being charitable to your Jewish friends so that you would not offend them when you were with them. So for example, you would have a potluck dinner and serve pulled pork. That would not be something kosher, and it would be an insult to the Jewish people, or those that came from that tradition. So again, it's interesting how they sorted that out. And then of course, you know that in all of Paul's letters and through most of the Acts of the Apostles, begins to talk about the mission to the Gentiles, how we begin to expand beyond the people of Israel and to include everybody else. So move ahead a little bit into the empire. The Roman Empire controlled the entire Mediterranean basin. And it's into this that the Christian communities begin to spread and to grow. And you have the early testimony of the New Testament kind of cataloging, especially in Paul's missionary journeys, of how that unfolds. We also then are conscious of the persecution that begins. I mean, how many early martyrs do we celebrate? People that were persecuted and died during that time. And it's interesting, the persecution begins with Nero. And it's not because he was focused on Christians for any reason, except that they were a convenient scapegoat. They were a small community, and literally his henchmen started a fire and burned out, several square miles of these massive Roman apartment complexes and killed untold numbers of people because he wanted to expand the palace. And all these apartment buildings were in the way. So when they burned down and there was nothing left and most of the people there died, it was a convenient way to then expand his palace grounds. But he had to find somebody to blame. And so there was this interesting little group that was around that kind of people knew about, heard vague things about, and so they were the ones that were accused of having started the fire. And of course, that was taken up right away. And so the first really persecutions were by way of scapegoating. But later it changes. And now the understanding is, especially as later emperors come on the scene, and they're trying to build a unity within this empire that stretches from Britain to Egypt and from the Black Sea to to Spain. And all these different peoples, different cultures. What can unify them? Well, the worship of the emperor. And so the emperors begin this idea of a cult. And they would deify themselves, and that this worship of the emperor, offering sacrifice, acknowledging his divinity, was an important piece. Now, for the vast majority of people who were pagans, what's one more God? It's not a problem. They don't lose sleep over it. But for Christians and Jewish people as well, they know the one true God. And they cannot just willfully offer sacrifice to something that is not God. And so again, this creates this conflict. And so various emperors, to various degrees, have persecutions going on of these Christian people. Interestingly, again, around the early 300s, Constantine wins the necessary battles and takes over the empire. And he attributes part of his victory to the sign of the cross, which he had the soldiers put on their shields. And as a result, he creates the Edict of Toleration, which really lifts all persecution of the Christian community. And in fact, because he is favorable, some significant people begin also to say, well, if the emperor likes it, I must become one of them myself. So again, you have people converting into the faith. And that really sets the stage for what you might call the growth of the first Christian culture, which comes up in the Middle Ages. It takes centuries for these tribes to have been slightly Romanized and for these tribes to really inculcate the faith and have the faith become the predominant part of their culture. So, and again, it's interesting, how does that happen? Well, a lot of it is through education. A lot of it is through the witness of these early Christians, especially monasteries. The monasteries, as the Roman Empire collapsed, became the sources of learning and preserving learning. to become the basis which will become the educational structure in Europe as universities are founded. And by the Middle Ages, by the time of Aquinas and Bonaventure, I mean, there are flourishing universities throughout Europe, and all of them are really grounded in the Christian ethos. And so again, you see a whole culture that has really been transformed from things that did not know God and did not know Jesus to things that now became very recognizable as Christian. Now, it's interesting that you look at the effects of the culture, language, and a lived Christianity. You know, there are little expressions. You know, one of the, German, if you go to the southern German territories, Bavaria and such, Austria, Switzerland, there's a little expression they have. Literally, they will say, Guter Gott, which means literally, I greet God in you. That's their greeting in the morning. In our German, the Protestants grunt at you and say, Morgen. But the Bavarians, the Catholics, literally, Grüß Gott, and the Swiss, Grüezi, I greet God in you. And again, it's that sense of how deeply the faith has begun to change even the language. And you can go to the other cultures. I never did anything with French or Spanish, but even like the Irish with the English, there's all kinds of little witticisms that just bring out their Catholic faith. So again, you see the depths of culture beginning to change, not just individual people and their prayer life, but how they live, how they speak, the things they celebrate, the customs that develop. Now, there are challenges along the way. There are various heretical movements that the church has to contend against. In fact, the feast day today for Saint Dominic, who was a contemporary of Saint Francis, both were facing the same challenge, the heresy of Albigensianism, started in southern France, spread to northern Italy and northern Spain. And it was a real attack on some of the most basic teachings of the church and on the nature of sacraments, and it had some real serious philosophical failures. But it gained momentum because the people that were pushing it were attacking what they conceived to be the kind of the luxury or the wealth of the church. That these bishops, these popes, these cardinals, these abbots of the great monasteries, they're living like kings, and we're down here barely making it. And that lack of witness to a simplicity of the gospel was a point that they were making hay on, as well as just outright errors. So Dominic founds the order of preachers, and their mission, their focus is to teach and to help really combat the falsehood of the heresy. Saint Francis, on the other hand, his people, they kind of lived a very radical sense of detachment and poverty and simplicity of the gospel, which again was a whole different witness that had been missing. And so both saints took on the same problem, but from different perspectives. And again, as a result, the Albigensian was lost. Now, the other major challenge was Islam. And Islam was very deeply missionary. I mean, their goal was to change the world. And they would do it by force if necessary. And the Islamic armies swept across northern Africa, crossed up into Spain, and really were only stopped by a Christian response in the south of France, and then pushed back into Spain. And then the Spanish kings took centuries to push them out of Spain back into North Africa. And the same thing, then later they would push up into Eastern Europe. They were stopped at the villages into really a domination of Islam and pushed further east beyond that. But again, it was a real challenge, and whether it's the Crusades or later problems, where there was this fight for who would really dominate the known world. Would it be Islam or Christianity? And as time goes on, you begin to see within Europe itself a slow growth of what we would call today secularism. And it was a reverse process of undoing the Christianity that had taken deep root in the Christian Europe. And some of it comes with the rise of the nation state, which is interesting because it breaks the bonds of faith between peoples. You know, it's not that there was not warfare all through the Middle Ages, it was constant warfare, as, you know, this group of nobles fought the other group of nobles. But at the end of the fight, they were all Christian, and they all recognized that. But with the rise of the nation state, your identity was no longer Christian, but I'm French, or I'm English, or I'm German, or I'm Italian, because they didn't have an identity till the late 1800s. But you understand the drift. And then, with the Reformation, was a serious challenge to both culture, to the church, and to faith. And it's a loss of the sacramental sense of life, because virtually all of the Protestant reformers really attacked the very sacramental structure of the church. They considered the priesthood was the source of all the problems in the church. Some people think it is today. They considered the sacraments being magic and were not really part of anything. That their idea was maybe baptism and Eucharist were the only two they kept for the most part. But they also began to lose the understanding of the real presence, because ultimately they required the priesthood to effect the real presence. And when you've gotten rid of the priesthood, then you also de facto get rid of the real presence. And implicitly, they must have understood that because they stopped teaching the real presence in the Eucharist, even though many of them celebrated some form of communion. And they also did away with the understanding of the Mass as sacrifice. That clearly, if you look at some of the texts in the other churches, sacrifice is just not even mentioned. And the idea of faith without the church really begins to come about. Their idea was what sola scriptura, the scriptures alone, or me and my Bible is all I need to be a Christian. I don't need the church, I don't need the Pope, and I don't need a bunch of bishops. Just me and the Bible, and I can be with Jesus. So this disconnect from the church is, again, part of what's happening with the Reformation. Now, on top of this, you also have what is a new humanism that is coming up. In some parts, they're looking at the old classics. They see the remnants of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, the temples, the aqueducts, the great buildings and things they had, and they were rediscovering the writings of the ancient Roman and Greek philosophers and poets. And this became part of, let's get back to the glory of the ancient world, which was not Christian. So again, there's this idea that in this humanism and this recovery of the classical world, it's a world without the Christian faith. And it begins to replace the Christian vision of the human person as a child of God is now autonomous. You can take care of yourself. You don't need God. And when you begin to look at the different philosophies, you begin to see this. So what happens then in philosophy, once you say that the human person really doesn't need God, that we can flourish all on our own, we were doing fine before the Christians came along and made us follow all these rules, that we had flourishing cultures and wonderful buildings and everything. Well, that was true, but the underlying thought was the autonomy of the human person. I'm no longer dependent on God. So how does this begin to affect different philosophies? Well, you get atheism, that we just don't believe in God anymore. And so we create a world with no reference to God. You get things like Marxism, where instead of God or the church, what's important is the state. And the state becomes the end-all and be-all of everything. And it's going to take care of you and tell you what you can do, what you can't do. And, as they sometimes say today, you won't own anything, but you'll be happy because we'll tell you you're happy. Subjectivism, again, it's that growth out of autonomy, that if God is not there, then, and I'm responsible for myself, then I create my own reality. I have my own truth. You can have yours, although if yours disagrees with mine, I will see that you're punished for it. But now we have the subjectivism. Nihilism, interesting where that comes up, that life has no meaning. Talk about getting ultimately depressed. But again, all of this has common origins as you begin to detach from God. And each of these things has a profound effect on the culture. I would argue that Marxism has virtually destroyed Russia. That 70 years of enforced communism has cut the heart out of the people there. And it'll take centuries before it's ever recovered. And even in the West, it was just recently I was reading an article where a college professor was talking about how they're seeing among their students so many young people are depressed. And they were describing this, and again, it's almost a nihilism, that life has no meaning, there's no future. They're either so frightened about the fact that, the earth is going to end in another 8 or 9 years, depending upon what your AOC is calculating from. And these people believe this stuff. And so they see no future for themselves. So they're depressed. And as people living in the culture today, we see this. We see the effects. We see, a growing sense of people who want to be socialist and communists, and this subjectivism. Pope Benedict, when he was elected, the eve before the election, he talked about the dictatorship of relativism, which is subjectivism. We see these things with tremendous influence around us. So takes us to where we are today. And where do we go? I was thinking about Pope John Paul II, and he would often talk about the idea of the enculturation of faith, that faith transforms culture, and it's a conscious activity undertaken by faith-filled persons. And for John Paul, everything was Christocentrism. Jesus was the center. And if you kind of read his things, you begin to see what he means by that. That with the birth of the Lord, when he stepped foot into our world, everything changed. creation changed. The Creator is now here in a very profound way. And the Creator is still here in a very profound way. Why do you think the Eucharist is here? It's the Creator, it's Jesus. He is now in his world, and he's accessible in this world. And so for John Paul, he understood that you can only really understand the human person in and through Christ, because Christ changed history. So when you begin to think about, language, customs, celebrations, family life, each of these are under attack today by the radical left. That's the opponent. That's who wants the hearts of our children. And really, as John Paul would say, it's a split between the civilization of love and the culture of death. It's really quite fascinating. There's that whole, with the decision of the Supreme Court, in effect saying there's no constitutional right to kill unborn children. It now devolves back to the states to answer that question for each particular state. This has so incensed the left, because this was one of their hallmarks. It's a culture of death. And once you tell people that, there's something wrong with killing unborn children, it is a shock to their system. And they react in the most violent and vehement ways, as we indeed saw in the culture around us. It's not lost on us that our own dear governor just X'd out funding for one of the longest standing supports for women in pregnancy. Just X'd it out of the budget. And, it's like they never met a child they wouldn't kill. And his whole party is embraced in that. And we are not being honest about that. This is not only bad philosophy, but it's diabolical influence as well. And if you go back to Pope John Paul, he really, when he talked about the year 2000 as a jubilee, and we were celebrating that, and we had all the different things leading up to that, it was meant to be really the beginning of a new flowering of Christianity. Now, it may take several centuries, but I do believe in a prophetic sense that John Paul saw that what was around him was unsustainable. And I think his own experience in Poland sort of pointed that out. I mean, Poland was totally controlled by the Communist Party. Nobody believed it, but it took some courageous actors to be able to push back. And as the people began to support it, it's interesting how 1989, it all collapsed. And again, with his push, I think President Reagan was engaged, and people like Lech Walesa in Poland were really saying back to the state that, no thanks, we don't want what you're selling. That's not who we are, that's not helping us, that's not being authentic to us. And you begin to see this, and it spread throughout all of Eastern Europe and even parts of Russia within, a really relatively short time, with not too many shots being fired. It fell, only to come over here and grow in our universities. It's interesting, if you look back over the millennium, first millennium, what happens? There's a great conversion. By the end, by the 900s, it's called the Dark Ages. was corruption and was bad. And there were some really terrible popes in that time period. NPR was to make stories about that crowd. And unfortunately, there's a lot there. So what happens? Beginning of the second millennium, beginning of the Middle Ages, it's a renewal of faith. In the time of Aquinas and Bonaventure, that Christianity was flourishing in Europe at that point. But then again, halfway through, it was undermined with the Reformation and all those other things. So, in light of what Pope John Paul was saying, that we should really use faith, let our faith transform us and we the culture. Really, how do we respond to all these challenges? It seems to me that there are three paths. The first is what I call the Amish plan, that everything focuses inward, we preserve whatever we can, which is what the Amish do. They hold themselves completely apart. They have their own language, own traditions, own dress, own everything. And they literally have kind of excised themselves out of the predominant culture. Again, it's based on their faith. That's one option. Second option is to accommodate. And it's interesting, this came up at the time of the end of the council. If you read anything there, you're going to hear the word aggiornamento. Aggiornamento is taken to mean to update or to kind of make yourself a little more friendly to the culture. And for some of the people, for example, for religious, it was maybe we'll update our habits. So instead of wearing garb that was really from the peasant life in the 14th century, we'll think of something that will be simple, but will be a little more easier to deal with today. And a number of communities did that, or I should say started that. And when all was said and done, their habit was reduced to a pin they wore on the lapel. And those same communities literally would actually tell you the day they died. Because they had no vocations and no future. But that's just a side piece. So the problem is, and it was interesting because there was a group of people that met with Pope Paul VI when all this stuff was the big rage. One of them was a German Lutheran, very deeply devout man. And he was, listening to all this. He was part of the group that met with Paul VI, and he said, people talk about the aggiornamento, we have to make nice with modern culture. And he said, accommodate to what? What in the culture do you want to accommodate to? And that was, I think, the most profound question that was asked at the time, near the end of the council. And it's a question we still have to ask today. If we're talking about accommodating, what part of the modern culture are you willing to buy? What part do you want? What part do you set aside the gospel to adopt? Because in effect, that's what you're looking to do. And then the third format is we have a treasure trove that's worth sharing and in fact transformative both of self and consequently of culture. We've done it. We've done it several times already. We do it constantly. As a parish priest, I meet people repeatedly who come and say, Father, I want to become a Catholic. There's something here that's worth being connected to. And it's because they have been thinking and looking, and they find that what is out there is just not fulfilling. It's not answering the question. what we've done, and, as I started by talking about some of the young people today in college, that, the depression is palpable. But virtually all of them have stopped going to church. They really don't pray much of anything. And they become so enamored or infused with, all the dire consequences of the climate. That's all they know. They literally have nothing to live for. And when we know Jesus, we have everything to live for. Because you have the ultimate live, which is eternal life. So again, it's interesting that, we really, and as you can imagine, I would advocate the third path, that we have everything worth sharing. But it has to transform us first. And then consequently, we begin to transform the culture. It'll take a while, but you know what? Time is on our side. Church will always be here. It might be smaller, as Pope Benedict predicted, but it will always be here. And then when the time comes, the people become so disenchanted with the stuff around them, they'll be ready to listen and to hear what we have to share with them. It's interesting, in light of the fact that I talked about the articles and the people talking about young people being depressed, there was a really interesting phenomenon that swept college campuses last year. And it was a minor revolution of faith on college campuses. People began, in some of the small colleges, they would gather to pray. And there would be people there all the time praying for a couple of days on end, and other people started joining in. And people were coming from other colleges to join in. And little by little, this started to spread to a number of places. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because isn't that what we do with veneration of the Blessed Sacrament? People pray all the time with the Lord. And, the bishop thought it was going to be a really hard undertaking to have each deanery have a perpetual adoration chapel. They got set up almost overnight. And every deanery has one. And they're still going and growing. And you constantly meet people and say, oh, yeah, I go to the adoration chapel. A couple of years ago, Father Matt came back was with a couple of his classmates. They had a couple of days of renewal. He came back and he said, what do you think about doing Holy Hour on Saturday morning? When they say Mass, we hear confessions. Very easy to have a Holy Hour as part of that. So we started. It's amazing. The people, we don't come out Saturday morning. Church is full. 8:30 for Mass, lines of confessions. People stay for a while to be with the Lord. And again, it's fascinating the way how stuff happens. People are drawn to it. Now, we have literally 9,000 people on the books. Might be a couple hundred there, but that's okay. The rest of the 9 will eventually catch on. But, it really is interesting when you think about it. I looked over that whole piece of the culture, trying to think of how to go through this tonight. And I thought it was worthwhile to not only just ask the question of what was the document talking about, but where were we, how did we get there, what happened to us along the way, where are we now, and really, what can we do with this whole question really was interesting. I didn't realize I had an interesting book on my bookshelf, which was a reflection by several different scholars coming at this from St. Thomas Aquinas, looking at culture. So it was an interesting moment to go back and read something I had parked on the bookshelf, but it really began with a council document and said one of the problems was that nobody sat down when they wrote that stuff in the document and sat down and put good philosophical thought behind it. They just wrote the document and they did a little history of the document itself. But they said there was, nobody really sat down and said, well, when you're talking about culture, and church, and faith, how do you do it? What kind of underpinnings are you going to put there? What kind of supports and props in terms of philosophy are you going to put there? So anyway, some interesting things, some of which are a little bit beyond me, but that's okay. Some of the other parts were good. So, questions, thoughts?
Well, Father, as you're speaking, I'm just wondering, you said, where are we today? And where are we today? And maybe because of my age, maybe because of what I read, I have a really strong question of where are we and where are we going as a church culture, not just culture in general, but as a church culture. Because I don't quite understand, maybe traditionalists, maybe I just don't understand some of Pope Francis' views and who's.
Oh, he's a Jesuit.
Yeah, I know.
So,
Hopefully the last one.
yeah, it is puzzling in a way, and it's sometimes challenging to understand exactly what he's getting at. Now, part of me says, I do understand what he says when he says, we're here for everybody. Unfortunately, the culture takes that two ways. Part of the culture says, well, if you're here for me, you're taking me as I want to be, and you're going to get whatever I bring to you. The other part says, we'd love to have you, and we'll tell you and help you along and tell you what Jesus says. And let that challenge you to see if maybe you need to change, just like I need to change, to be conformed more deeply to the gospel. So the day they close the lid on me, that will have to happen. I always have to be transformed by the gospel. But the problem is the parts don't want to have to be. And I think in heart, the Holy Father really does believe that people do need to be transformed by the gospel. And he's hoping, I think, they can argue whether he's naive or not, that by encountering people, by accompanying them, as he says, that you'll draw them in and they'll begin to see the gospel and hear it and be slowly transformed by it. Trusting that is his ultimate goal, which again, that's okay. I have to say, historically, when you look back and you look at the what they used to call the Ostpolitik, which was the curial approach to communism. I think for a while, some of them thought they were going to win. The communists were going to win, and we had to make peace with them in order to save the church. And kind of Cardinal Casaroli, I think, was Secretary of State under Paul VI. And he had this thing where he was constantly trying to cut deals with the communists to kind of save the church here and there. And it never worked. And again, the Holy Father and the church as a whole is will be preserved from error, not bad judgment. And you can go back over history and find all kinds of things where people made bad decisions politically or economically. There was a whole, it was very interesting if you go back to the late 70s, early 80s, that you had some American bishops who were talking about, and when they would talk, it was like, oh, well, we all have to do with less so people can have more, so some people can get more. Other people came along and said, well, you have two different ways of looking at this. One is that there's a fixed pie, and you just have to cut the pieces smaller so everybody gets a piece. The other way is saying, grow the pie, bake a second pie. And isn't it fascinating that production of stuff, of food and everything, is astronomical today compared to where it was in 1900. We can literally feed 6-7 billion people. We do grow enough food for that. Now, we're still hungry people, but that's another problem. Usually it's corrupt and inefficient governments that's causing that. Not the fact that we don't have enough food around. But, and again, you have different philosophical approaches and different ways of looking at things. And sometimes, people come up with their approaches and they can be criticized for it. But then again, I'm just a parish priest. It's not far from retirement.
Father, I would
Yes.
like you to invite you to join the Crucio. I think you would find a comfortable group of people that share your view, and I think you would enjoy the experience of what comes from Blessed Sacrament on a weekend. So, give some thought to it, but we'd love to have you on board.
Yeah, I've always resisted getting attached to any one particular. There's so many different good movements out there. But I've somewhat resisted that over the years.
I fought it for 30 years.
Yeah.
I'm glad I gave it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's the church is so rich in all the different ways that, there are some people that, are deeply drawn by the charismatic prayer movement, and they just find a home there, and that just is perfect for them. Other people, families that are drawn to the Mass at St. Lawrence, to the 1962 Missal. They love it. They just find that's what nurtures them. And the church is rich in all these different expressions. I'm probably a little more at home with St. Thomas Aquinas. In another era, I might have been a Dominican. But when I started out, they were in trouble too. Although they've gotten much better today. I can say that the Dominicans, especially the group down in the Catholic U, I don't know, there's a whole program, Aquinas 101. If you go to YouTube, put in Aquinas 101, just dozens and dozens of fascinating programs, all by these Dominicans down at CU, and they're really wonderful. Some of them are deeply philosophical, but others are just very practical and really good. And one day, I went to the doorbell rang, and one of the Dominicans was standing at the door. He said, "Can I use your restroom?" And here he was, for some reason, somebody drove him up from Washington, and somebody else was meeting him to take him up to New York. And it just so happened this was their meeting place because we're right off of 81. And it was his time to hit the restroom. So, and then I recognized him immediately. Yeah. So, an interesting chat. Then we had another one stay with us a couple reflection to the diocesan priests the other month. And Father Speitel invited him to stay with us for the night. And so I had breakfast with him the next morning, and we just talked for like 2 hours. And he was telling me about a new book that came out, and then he sent it to me. So it was on St. Thomas, but it was very interesting. So again, they're a wonderful group, and it's nice because, they had bad leadership back in the 70s, but they got past that. And now they were really, the Eastern province of the Dominicans is really a very solid group. And we have a wonderful group of Nigerian Dominicans helping out in quite a few of our parishes, and Hershey met as chaplains there. So you're welcome.
Thank you.